listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my indomitable co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's go against the grain. Despite being hunkered down in our dwellings, I am rather energetic this morning. Solid 5 hours of sleep, and I'm fully powered. We're composed of prodigiously good show today. Down goes Boris. Down goes Boris. Alpha male Boris Johnson has been hospitalized over symptoms of the COVID-19 virus. How's that herd immunity going, Boris? Yes, I wish I was a better person not to get grim pleasure out of this news, but I'm sorry, I am not. Herd immunity is basically the Malthusian, let the weak die and the strong persist. Have fun in that NHS that you and your party butchered and privatized. I must have lived in the UK in a past life. I have this feeling about the Tories that goes beyond this notion of the intellectual, despite not living there. In the second hour, we'll keep the good energy going, and we'll bring on Anya Prampil, journalist and former reporter for RT. Before I say anything else, I want to congratulate her on a recent marriage with reporter and journalist Max Blumenthal. Max ghosted me in coming on my show. Yes, I'm bitter about that, if I'm being honest. That being said, I am genuinely happy for both of them. We'll be discussing the provocative actions by the United States in Venezuela and Maduro initiating the military. We'll also get into domestic politics, asking whether Trump acting in Venezuela is a wag the dog scenario. We'll also be discussing the hysteria around Joe Rogan voting or potentially voting for one Trump over Biden. Last but not least, we have our Mr. Press segment where we'll lampoon the talking heads of the Sunday shows. I can't be sure, but I'm sure Bob's favorite everyman, or I should say every newsman, Mr. Oblivious Chuck Todd, will be making an appearance. I always love Bob's enthusiasm in putting the proverbial knife in Chuck Todd, particularly when it's earned. But first, let's start here. I started this monologue at 2 a.m. I couldn't sleep, and when real men can't sleep, real men do the news. I immediately stopped the original monologue and diverged into a rage. MSN comes out with an article, Joe Biden is confident that Bernie Sanders supporters will fall in line. That language, fall in line, was my trigger point. Biden says, if I'm the nominee, I'm confident Bernie will push his supporters to support me, just as I would if it were reversed. The former vice president told donors late Thursday. He's poured his heart and soul into this. He's made some significant changes in the American politics that have been positive. Fall in line. My intention here is not to imbue myself and the people of similar cause with an inflated self-importance or cosmic purpose. My wife says I have a tendency towards describing the mundane in grand, sweeping, dramatic terms. The fact is, though, that some things do trend towards the epic in scale. Whether our bearing is chosen in some incorporeal space, whether it's accepted in parental and cultural upbringing, or whether it's chosen in an affirmative path to more rational world, we on the left are bound as the living conscience of this nation, and in further extension, this world. Considering the gravity of our charge and what's at stake, we should be lions. We ache for what this world is in comparison to what this world could be. We're cursed with the realization that life, the world order, is not appointed by a dystopian God, but by a political and economic system that is organized to cater to oligarchs versus utilizing the resources of this nation for the people that produces the resources of this nation. I'm not asking for anything radical in as much as the sensible, the rational, providing that the goalpost is a society where a person is honored as intrinsically valuable, not because God says so, but because we as a collective and as a society deem it so. What does your world look like without homeless, with a healthcare system that everyone is covered, where every person in this country has an education and can get an education without the hindrance of tens of thousands of dollars of debt on their backs? Imagine a situation where everyone that chooses to get an education to the degree that they choose Talk about removing the hindrances to innovation and creativity. Even under a capitalistic system, that is possible. Imagine the products, the new technologies, the advances, when cash is no longer a barrier to progress. None of this is impossible. It must be understood that this is not an issue of resources. It is entirely an issue and purely an act of cultural, ideological, and political will within a society to make it so. I've said this before because it is infinitely true. From a purely corporeal point of view, there is no point to this existence. I won't be arrogant to say that God is dead, but he certainly hasn't made an appearance in any real capacity where it could be part of the conversation. This is terrifying in some sense, the notion that there is no higher order. You are living in a godless world, boy, to take a word from supernatural. The truth is that each of us, sane or otherwise, individuated unit of consciousness make their own reality. As a society, we define a general way of interaction and organization. This, by extension, also means that how we organize ourselves, how we set up our government, what that government prioritizes, is not an issue of right or wrong. It is an issue of what do you require that particular edifice to accomplish. There is no ultimate point beyond our choice, explicit or implicit. We choose. The point is that in a reality space where there is no point, no right or wrong in organizing, the overwhelming majority of us toil away our products of our labor, transformed into cash and expropriated to the top, while we persistently vulnerable, paying taxes to a government that attends to the needs of the wealth of the nation. Why is this our lot? And realizing this, why should it continue to be so? Do we believe that people have value or not? Should the government not be organized to incentivize such policies? Why? What has crippled your imagination so, where you can't conceive of an infinitely conceivable outcome? I understand over the last 40 years that the Democratic Party has dealt with such incrementalism, such small ideas, that the norm and what people consider to be the norm is effectively that. That is just a relative position, and it doesn't necessarily have to be so. The question for the left is now what? Will your aspirations be fulfilled in one glorious election? At this point, I would say that is probably not going to happen. The left needs to question its behavior over the past 40 years and regard itself as something fundamentally different than the Democratic Party and organize across the country with specific goals and objectives it wishes to accomplish, and refuse the race to the bottom and the cowardly capitulation that has crippled the left, not just to get real things accomplished, but also has placed you in a disposition that incentivizes marginalization and disrespect. The Bernie people will fall in line. They've done so for the past 40 years, regardless of what we've done, regardless of the policies we've passed, regardless of how we've talked about them, they would fall in line. Why would they do anything differently than they've done prior? Hey, Joe Biden, millions of people have lost their health care because 10 million people lost their jobs. That number is only going to get worse. The overwhelming majority of Democrats are for Medicare for all. The overwhelming majority of the population is for Medicare for all. The number has gone up 9 points over the last few months. You, Joe Biden, have lost the argument. Even in states that voted for you by 30 points, Sanders won the argument, and those people chose Medicare for all. And yet, right now, in the middle of a pandemic, if you ask Joe Biden to see for Medicare for all, Joe Biden says this. Let's play the clip.
Are you now reconsidering your position when it comes to single-payer health care?
Single payer will not solve that at all. The thing that is needed is, for example, we have a whole number of hospitals that are being so stretched, including rural hospitals, they're going to need more financing. That doesn't come from a single payer system. That comes from the federal government stepping up and dealing with the concerns that they have, the reimbursement that they're going to get, how they're going to be able to move forward, and how they're going to be able to provide all the needed help that are needed in their communities. This is an opportunity to look at reconstructing the healthcare system in a way that, in fact, can respond more rapidly and more effectively to these kinds of crises, because it's going to come again.
Joe Biden may not know this, but during Obamacare, those rural hospitals actually got more cash. You know why? They got more cash because more people were able to actually pay. Meaning, under a Medicare for All system, those rural hospitals would be flush with cash because more people who are going to those hospitals would be capable of paying for the services at the hospital with Medicare for All. He doesn't know that. The catch here is Joe Biden doesn't care about you. Joe Biden is still trying to push people to go to the election and help him cross the finish line sooner, not later, despite the fact that people could die in that process. Not only does he not care about you, he doesn't care about what you want, which is kind of my basic point. Of all the ideas of the left, the things that we want to get accomplished, the pain of poverty, the pain of not being able to get health care, the pain of college debt, the pain of the environment under siege for monetary gain, the pain of population destroyed by the boot of U.S. militarism, you have nowhere else to go has been the monster at the door stopping you from accomplishing your emancipatory objectives, the things that you have been philosophically and cosmically bound to get done. This party that you have associated yourself with, that you have been cowed by, that you have been effectively the politically abused spouse of, is not in line with getting the objectives that you want to get accomplished. If 2020 hasn't told you that, if 2020 hasn't, or 2016 hasn't shown you that, nothing will. They are diametrically opposed to our objectives. Sanders tried to make this point to Joe Biden that you need to energize people, otherwise you're going to lose. Let's hear the clip.
I frankly have my doubts. Look, if I lose this thing, Joe wins. Joe, I will be there for you. But I have my doubts about how you win a general election against Trump, who will be a very, very tough opponent, unless you have energy, excitement, the largest voter turnout in history. And to do that, you are going to have to bring young people who are not great voters. They don't vote in the kinds of numbers they should into the political process. I have my doubts.
Yeah, Bernie is absolutely right. Joe Biden is getting 24% enthusiasm compared to 53% of Trump's enthusiasm. And even though people might consider Joe Biden to be electable, that's just a relative perspective. Hillary Clinton was considered inevitable, and she lost. John Kerry lost. Al Gore lost. I'm unclear why Joe Biden will be any different. If you are on the left and you want to get any real thing accomplished, you need to grab your power, grow a spine, and use the gravity of all of the pain and anguish that is in the world that you want to remedy as your strength. Listen to Lawrence O'Donnell, and I'm going to end it on Lawrence O'Donnell because he makes the point extraordinarily clear. Let's play the clip.
If you want to pull the party, the major party that is closest to the way you're thinking, to what you're thinking, you must show them that you're capable of not voting for them.
Yes, that's what it boils down to. Bob, I am on this organizing kick with you now. I think this is one of those things where we need to change how we go about this process. And we need to organize, stand strong, stop the race to the bottom, come up with political objectives that you want to get accomplished, and have a litmus test on those political objectives. What do you think about that, Bob?
Yeah, I think the Bernie Sanders organizing around the presidential campaign seems like the Hail Mary to me. Of course, you want to throw the pass. Of course, we want to talk about what the play looks like and which receivers you want downfield for him to accomplish that. But I think the longer strategy of what you're talking about is an economic movement across the United States. Occupy Wall Street was something before I personally got involved in journalism and politics myself. It's been 9-10 years since that movement unfolded. I think that's where people need to put a lot of attention to, Jamar, because you need several years to build these national movements. You need people to be outside in the streets to some degree to pressure these big banks. And I think you nailed the nail on the head talking about how so much of it's imagined, and this idea that billionaires must exist and as if the government needs to only give direct payouts to corporations and to big banks. Right now, if people at home were given $10,000, $15,000 injections, which is all just fictionalized, right, Jamar? We could do that tomorrow if we collectively wanted to. I think people would be able to stay at home safely and have their basic needs met. And so I think there needs to be a bigger revolution and movement of people, Jamar, but it's talking about what's going to happen right now compared to the long run. I think we have that to talk about, Jamar, a lot of other things. We're going to first turn our attention to the United Kingdom with our guest, Mohammed Al-Mazi. We're going to talk a little bit about the leader of the herd, Boris Johnson, headed to the hospital, Labour finding a new leader, and the ways in which COVID-19 are ripping through the prisons where one Julian Assange currently sits. You're listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits?
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik?
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story? From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course, come on in.
Aren't you glad you didn't say MSNBC?
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with Bob Schlehuber. And as always, we appreciate your tweets and calls. You can reach us at 202-521-1320 if you have anything to add on the topic at hand. Also, please give us a like if you're digging the content, only if you're digging the content. Bob's man beard grows 0.01% faster with each like that we get, so definitely give us some likes. So let's hop across the pond. Now, I cover British politics on my channel for the last 3 years. I haven't done so recently as the Corbyn loss was painful, not to mention we were in the midst of our own political season and Sanders was our standard bearer. But interesting things have started to happen since Brexit. Now, the era of Jeremy Corbyn has finally, unfortunately, painfully come to an end. And our current as I mentioned earlier, or Boris Johnson, as I mentioned earlier. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Boris Johnson has been hospitalized with COVID-19. Do I get a sick thrill from Bojo getting this virus? Honestly, yes, a little bit. Now, Boris has been hospitalized with the COVID-19 virus, and the UK, apparently this little island, is also being ravished by this particular virus. 40,806 cases, 4,934 deaths. Johnson has taken an about-face on this policy of herd immunity, locking down the country and expanding social services. To discuss, we're joined by journalist Mohammed Elmazi, contributor to numerous outlets, including Canary, Interregnum.net, The Gray Zone, and Sputnik International. Mohammed, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. So the original policy of the Tory government was herd immunity, literally the opposite of what rational scientific and medical actors indicate. Now, some of the people have contested that the government really was pushing that particular policy in the beginning. So let's listen to Sir Patrick Vallance, the government chief scientific advisor. Let's hear the clip.
To try and reduce the peak, broaden the peak, not to suppress it completely. Also, because most people, the vast majority of people, get a mild illness, to build up some degree of herd immunity as well, so that more people are immune to this disease and we reduce the transmission. At the same time, we protect those who are most vulnerable from it. Those are the key things we need to do.
So how fitting is that Boris Johnson gets taken by COVID-19? How's the herd immunity treating you, Bojo? Mohammed, what was he thinking? Like, honestly, when you're listening to scientists, they're very clear that the goal of social distancing is to keep down the number of people with that virus. You don't necessarily want to overwhelm your medical services, kind of like New York or Italy or Spain. What was he thinking in pushing this particular policy originally?
That's an excellent question. And I think part of the frustration that many people have is the lack of transparency in the decision-making process originally. So, for example, now when presentations are made by government officials, the slides and various pieces of information are made public by the government. You can go and you can find them and you can download them. But previously, information, it wasn't just, who knows why and who was responsible for this decision, but even Public Health England weren't publishing their models, for example. So it's quite difficult to be certain, completely certain, what they're thinking when you don't know exactly what they're being told by the various medical and scientific experts. Are they being given options, and are they choosing from those options? Because obviously the economy is something they're thinking about. So are they being told, well, there's a more drastic option which might protect more people but be more severe for the economy? As one person who works in global health told me, that there is evidence of a sort of a right libertarian sort of outlook in terms of individualism and the need to protect business, as it were, that seem to shape the thinking, at least initially. It is important to note that the Netherlands and Sweden do seem to be going their own way in this. They're not following the kind of lockdown approach that Britain ultimately decided
But Mohammed,
to take over.
Yeah, Mohammed, I'm curious, Mohammed. I mean, having just come off of Brexit, you have a populace that is oriented around individualism and self-isolation, who put their own interest to be apart from others at the cost of the economy in the first place, thinking that would be best for the economy. And so in a pandemic like this, why would we expect the government of Boris Johnson to think globally or to think critically about how to meet the needs of all of their community and all of their society? I mean, under-testing for me has been done purposely, and it's been done the least frequent in hard-hit areas. And I think we've seen stuff like Grenfell Tower in England over the last years, and how the poor there in that country continue to suffer at the hand of the right-wing, neoliberal, neoconservative models that Boris Johnson's bringing into the office right now. And so I think we're seeing the ravages of that across the UK. Am I wrong?
Well, when it comes to, we're definitely seeing the consequences of years of austerity, but I would say certainly over the last 10 years implemented by both the Tory and the Liberal Democrats when they first came into power in coalition, and then the Tories thereafter. Although, to be fair, lots of these policies go back even further. When it comes to testing, it's not completely clear. I think one of the issues, it does look like it could very well be that they don't have enough testing capability, because lots of people were very frustrated, including people who work in healthcare that I've been speaking to, saying, like, what's going on with the testing? And one of the things I've been hearing is that actually they just don't have the ability, despite being an incredibly wealthy country, one of the wealthiest countries on earth, and a country that used to have a healthcare system that was the envy of the world. They just didn't seem to be prepared, even as it was becoming clear that it was going to become some kind of issue when you're looking at other countries, before it really started to break out here. So is it possible that they're under-testing deliberately here? Yes, although I would say that for now, my suspicion is that they just don't have the testing capability. There were promises of testing people up to 100,000 a day now, after they came under fierce criticism across the even mainstream press. But if you look at the numbers, just to say some of the most recent figures to date, as of 9 a.m. today, 6th of April, 252,958 tests have concluded, right? So we're nowhere near the 100,000 a day that were being promised, or at 1,200,000 by the Prime Minister. So there's even contradictory numbers that we're being told in terms of how many people we can expect to be tested per day.
I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
Of those tested, 51,608 tested positive. This is as of 6 a.m. today, 9 a.m. today, 6th of April. And as of 5 p.m., 5th of April, because the figure is a bit delayed in terms of how many people have died, there's 5,373 have died who have tested positive with coronavirus. So, yes, anybody who I recommend practically anybody I speak to, including if they're in the United States, to watch this documentary. It's a new documentary called The Great NHS Heist, which is about the 40-year project of privatizing Britain's National Health Service. And then once you understand the process of outsourcing, privatization, and dismantling that the National Health Service has been subjected to in this country over 40 years, both by New Labour under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, as well as by the Tories from Margaret Thatcher onwards to today, you get a far clearer picture as to what state the healthcare service is in when it ends up dealing with healthcare generally, and then anything like this sort of crisis more specifically.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I had a question specifically on that. I'm curious how the public is responding to this. I mean, the Tories have cut into the NHS for decades, not to mention new labor, like you said, new labor. I mean, basically the Tony Blair government was a neoliberal government that was also into this notion of privatizing the NHS. I remember there was a story that came out last year that made the point that people were dying in ambulances outside the hospitals because of the cuts to the NHS. They were incapable of dealing with the winter. Knowing that the Tories had cut into the NHS in this way, and New Labour cut into NHS this way, how is the public responding to all of these people dying from this particular pandemic?
Well, see, that's an interesting question, and I suppose it depends on which sections of society and where on social media and which papers you read. Notwithstanding what I've just told you, that the NHS has been subjected to 40 years of privatization, that's not accepted as being fact in the mainstream legacy or establishment press. It's not like the BBC has been describing it that way. Okay, yeah, people like Jeremy Corbyn have brought it to the fore in terms of their criticism when they talk about NHS cuts. But the information that's in the documentary, it's not like that documentary is showing on BBC, although it should be. So there is a background sort of generalized understanding among large segments of the population that austerity has meant NHS. But it's not like any of these politicians have publicly accepted that they're seeking to privatize NHS. Tony Blair didn't do that. They did shove in a bunch of money after the Thatcher years, although they also engaged in all kinds of privatization techniques that caused lots of that money to sort of funnel out away from the hospitals towards private, like finance, through private finance initiatives. Theresa May, I recall, and David Cameron, when they were both prime ministers and head of the Tory party, they were explicitly saying that this is just fear-mongering from Labour. We will always protect the NHS. We love the NHS. You know, even now under Boris Johnson, all these signs are about save the NHS, stay at home, don't go out unless you absolutely have to, save the NHS. So it's not like this is accepted that there has been 40 years of undermining of the National Health Service. But information does bleed through, and there are sections of society which I would say are quite furious. Other segments which are, you know, okay, they're going about their lives and saying, well, we all have to stick together. We shouldn't be partisan. You know, the usual kind of thing that you'd get even in the United States, where, you know, there are segments of the political class which will be partisan when it's in their interests, but then when it's not their interest to be, they will say, well, we should all be in this together and we shouldn't be partisan. So it's a mixed bag. It depends on. I actually had somebody recently when I was telling them about that documentary. They said to me somewhat skeptically, they're like, really? Is that really happening? Right? So it's, you know, it's not in your face. You get isolated stories. You don't always get the full picture of what's been done.
Well, even with the number of deaths, though, I mean, let's take the NHS part off the table for the moment. Is Boris Johnson getting the blame for the number of people that have been dying in the UK? I mean, that number has been extremely high in comparison to some of the other nations. The UK is tiny compared to the United States, and you guys almost have half our death total. Do they point to the Boris Johnson government as responsible for all of these deaths and the unpreparedness in regards to the UK's response?
Well, I did notice the sort of front pages a few days ago where they were unusually critical, everything from the FT to the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail is like a proper right-wing outlet, and the Financial Times, you know, the Financial Times is a proper establishment outlet, and all the others in between. I mean, The Guardian, which is sort of the liberal voice of the establishment, if you like, and it has been very critical. Right, and plenty of the articles in there have been very critical, but so have the other papers. So yeah, I would say as things have gone on, once it's become clear that political leaders, including Johnson, were not being straight with people, they're not being transparent with figures, right? Including testing, like what's going on with testing? Why didn't you start testing more people when you saw what was going on in China? I mean, that's the kind of thing, because you can understand, you know, you're not going to just put your entire economy on standstill because a few people start getting sick. There are viruses that come out every so often. But once it became clear that other states were running into serious issues, It's become clear here that they weren't taking the kinds of measures that, quite frankly, I just assumed they would be, just from a common sense perspective of like, okay, we need to prepare, we need to have more ventilators, we need to have more testing, and we need to start rolling this out. They didn't. They do seem to have sort of been playing it by ear, playing it sort of reflecting a very sort of a laissez-faire attitude of as we mentioned before, of society and of the economy. And yeah, I would say that especially the last 5 days to a week, there has been increasing levels of criticism for these failures. But at the same time, certain information is only bleeding through towards certain information is only bleeding out via certain outlets. Yeah. Like for example.
And Jamar.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say to Jamar. I mean, this is what we're going to see, right? Is it's going to take some months for everything to really set into people to really understand the full failings of what could have been done. And when you see a slow recovery, people thought this thing was going to be in and out after a month. And I think that's what Boris Johnson and Donald Trump thought. It would just kind of rip through the communities for a few weeks. They would take some hits. It would hurt the economy. Some poor people, some people of color, they would die, and then it would be gone. But I think it's going to stay in the news, Jamar. But it really, for me, depends on if there's an opposition voice in the U.S. or UK that actually can harness that opposition to these leaders and provide an alternative to the American people. We're not seeing that in the U.S. What are we seeing in the UK?
Oh, that's a really good point, Bob. And so Labor, to make the point, Labor, Jeremy Corbyn is no more. And so the UK has this new Ken doll, or you could say basically the Trudeau of Canada or the Obama of the United States or the Macron of France, or in this case, the Ken Starmer. So let's hear a clip from Ken Starmer introducing himself to the world now that Jeremy Corbyn is no more. Let's play the clip.
It is the honour and the privilege of my life to be elected as leader of the Labour Party. It comes at a moment like none other in our lifetime. Coronavirus has brought normal life to a halt. Our cities, our towns and our villages are silent. Our roads deserted. Public life has all but come to a standstill. And we're missing each other. People are frightened by the strangeness, anxious about what will happen next. And we have to remember that every number is a family shaken to its foundation, unable even to carry out the most poignant of ceremonies, a funeral, in the way that they would like. It reminds us of how precious life is, but also how fragile. It reminds us of what really matters. Our family, our friends, our relationships, the love we have for one another, our health, our connections with those that we don't know, a greeting from a stranger, a kind word from a neighbour. These make up society. They remind us that we share our lives together. We have to trust one another and look after one another. And I can see
Jamal, we got to stop. I can't
people
hear
coming
anymore.
together,
the whitest of all white people.
It's
rough. The leadership role at Labor.
It's rough. It's so rough. I listened to this clip and I'm like, I have no idea what this guy wants. Mohammed, it was a painful thing watching Jeremy Corbyn lose this race. And him taking this weird non-position when the issue in the election was going to be Brexit. And now they have Ken Starmer. So he spent 8 minutes with a Hillary Clinton speech, basically speaking for 8 minutes and saying absolutely nothing. So what on earth is Ken Starmer's objective in this particular position as a leader of the opposition?
Well, I think in his objective, as I've said to people for a number of years now, is that he'd like to be prime minister. So Keir Starmer, it's a sad state of affairs, really, in terms of who Keir Starmer once was. So I remember studying a case that he was heavily involved in when he was working in human rights as a human rights barrister in the so-called McLibel case. This is over 20 years ago now. When he was representing Helen Steele and somebody else who were being prosecuted for defamation by McDonald's. So on the one hand, this multi-billion-dollar corporation prosecuting them, and he helped to represent them pro bono in this case that lasted years. And you can even see him in this documentary, McLibel, if you can find it online perhaps, and compare that guy to this guy. Since then, of course, he's become a chief prosecutor, and he was chief prosecutor for many years before he ended up becoming a politician. So I suppose that's a good pathway if you want to be a politician. So in terms of him personally, yeah, I would say that here, let me give you a quote that Chris Williamson MP, a 40-year member of the Labour Party until he was recently pushed out, a staunch supporter of Corbyn's policies. This is a quote he gave me just now. The shadow cabinet appointments suggest a return to new Labour nostrums and a consensus between the two major parties based on neoliberalism. Anyone who hasn't already left the party, who is hoping to see Labour arguing for some semblance of socialism to respond to the significant economic, social, and environmental problems that have been created by capitalism, will be sorely disappointed, end quote. So that's Chris Williamson from Derby. Yeah, certainly if that's your perspective, if you support sort of the Corbyn side of policies, the types of policies championed by Jeremy Corbyn and others that were in the previous shadow cabinet, yeah, you'll be disappointed if you fully appreciate what this shadow cabinet's about. Here's the thing. It's very clear that the vast majority of the Labour Party membership still support the previous manifesto, right? So the policies under the Corbyn-led Labour Party from 2019 and from 2017 have wide support. And in fact, research which I cite that was done by this right-wing free market think tank called the Legitim Institute, which is like a proper market fundamentalist institute. And they did a very large survey where they asked people what they thought about, nationalization of everything from banks to the weapons industry to all kinds of sectors, utilities, trains, planes, and automobiles, basically, right? So plenty of things that you could think of, along with other policies. And they showed like widespread, support across the brackets. So if you don't, because people can be very tribalistic, right? If they hear Labour Party policy, they'll be like, well, I'm a Tory, so I don't support it, right? But if you just ask across the board, across age groups and demographic groups and what have you, what do you think about these policies of bringing these things, not even under democratic control, that's not how they worded it, they just worded it under state control, like nationalization. It had very widespread support, high 60, 70, even 80% support across the UK. So,
and Mohammed, on that point, obviously hindsight's 2020 now with Corbyn's decision to call for elections. Wasn't the win for Jeremy Corbyn to have allowed for the United Kingdom to leave the EU, let that be on the hands of Boris Johnson, and then afterwards then call his government into question when he starts to fail in a moment like this? Obviously, nobody was predicting a pandemic, but something like this was going to happen in the UK as they continue to push austerity measures. And once they left the European Union, you're going to have these issues. And what the Labour centrists have been able to do now is say, look, it was a referendum on Corbyn. You need to put the more moderate voice in. But the more moderate voice doesn't even have the favorability of the populace. And so it just seems like Corbyn's calculation was all wrong. And now Labour's left with this false notion that people want moderate positions.
Well, so there's multiple aspects to that. Is that Corbyn had to step down, right? There was no way he couldn't step down as leader after that loss, right? So after the loss,
but why did he ever take the loss in the first place? Is the question.
Well, in terms of, different people will argue different things in terms of where the main source of the loss is. Some people will say that it was the heavy level of media sort of attack and sort of even the military-industrial complex was amazingly the level of leaking and statements, over 40 statements against him, calling him a threat to national security. I think there's very strong evidence to show that it was ultimately the Labour Party's position on the second referendum, which Corbyn ultimately agreed to. He was pressured into accepting it, not least of which by people like Keir Starmer, by the way. It should be clear, Jeremy Corbyn did not support joining the European Union. He opposed Britain joining the European Union, and he supports its removal from the European Union, right? But he
is a Eurosceptic. That's true. However, and on the question on Brexit, This election was on Brexit. And Jeremy Corbyn, who was a Eurosceptic, gets cowed into this position, by people like Keir Starmer, when they knew the question of Brexit was not going to be, meaning the public chose to leave. And you have a referendum where the public says, let's go. The Tory party, Boris Johnson, makes the argument that he's for freedom and justice because the Labour Party effectively abandoned their position in regards to Brexit. So Jeremy Corbyn comes up in the election, he argues with a straight face that we're not going to take a position on Brexit. What we're going to do is we're going to put it up for another referendum, ignoring the first referendum, and all of the people who are backing him are against Brexit. Now, how is the public supposed to regard this? And the public regarded it as, we don't believe this guy is being straight with us. And so all the policy positions that Jeremy Corbyn had that might have been popular would have been great in a situation where Brexit wasn't on the table. I understand that all of these people were going to be against Jeremy Corbyn, but Jeremy Corbyn knew that. Doesn't that require a certain degree of strength in doing his particular policies as opposed to being cowed into a position that was going to fundamentally lose?
Look, I don't support like the position. So I'm just having to offer the most generous reading, right? It's not like I didn't support just to make something very clear, because the last time I was speaking to other people on the radio, I raised this before the election. I did say that the leadership is a possible situation because the majority of the membership of the Labour Party voted to remain, right? And that majority of that membership was very supportive of Jeremy Corbyn and came in because they're very supportive of him and they supported that policy. But on Brexit specifically, they voted remain. And those were in particular younger people, right? The majority of the parliamentary Labour Party, so there's members of Parliament who were MPs, including many of them who were supportive of Corbyn, but also those who weren't supportive of Corbyn, also very much in favour of the European Union, right, and membership of the European Union. But, as you point out, the majority of the electorate, especially within the seats that they needed to win, right, voted leave. So you're in a situation where there is a square peg and a round hole, where only a few members of the parliamentary Labour Party were always opposed to EU membership. But when you have the majority of your own party demanding and pressurizing constantly that we need to adapt the position, that we need to adjust the position a bit, that ended up resulting successfully. This shows you it's difficult to describe the level of pressure that was placed on the leadership for him to ultimately go against his better judgment. And if we saw the 2017 election, where the manifesto was basically quite similar to the 2019 manifesto, they had major gains in 2017 compared to years previous. Right? And the difference there is, if you notice, one key difference was they said, we're going to respect the referendum results. By the time it came around, the level of pressure was so intense, and the attack, threats of resignation, and constant threats of resignation from the shadow cabinet and all the rest of it. But eventually,
I accept all that. I truly accept it. Like, I accept that his backbenchers are pressuring him and everything else. But if you're Corbyn and you need to get elected, and you need to win that election, it becomes almost impossible to win the election with that particular position. Bojo was able to make this argument that basically, I am for freedom and justice because I am accepting the referendum. Even if that means Parliament is against me, even if that means, like, he took this Herculean effort and the public looked at him and said, that's the guy who's going to get that done. And you ask the question, is it possible for Jeremy Corbyn to have taken a similar position saying, look, the public wants this, and I'm going to run in the interest of the public on Brexit. Even if it's a soft Brexit, I'm going to run in the interest of the public on Brexit, accepting that it is impossible for him to win with the weird position that he was taking.
I would agree with you. I mean, was it possible? Absolutely. I'll give you another example just by coincidence. Chris Williamson, when I spoke to previously as well, this was like months ago now, when I'd asked him after the results came through, he said, look, I had campaigned for Remain, but once Brexit came about, I then said, okay, what we need to do is argue our Brexit versus their Brexit, the people's Brexit. And he said, just before he was suspended from the party, this is Chris Williamson, he spoke to his fellow MPs, Labour MPs, at a meeting in which he said, what we need to be arguing for is that we can present a people's Brexit rather than the bankers' Brexit, which Boris will bring you a bankers' Brexit in favor of major corporations, will bring you a Brexit which will defend, basic union rights and individual rights, etc. And he said he was shouted down, not by the Labour leadership, by the masses of the fellow PLPs. So
Wow.
thereafter, he was suspended for under allegations of anti-Semitism. But that's a whole other thing, like unsubstantiated allegations, I should point out.
Wow, that's astonishing. Let me ask you about Assange before we close. We have about a minute left. What is the case up to this point? There have been protests about Assange being in the prison system with the COVID-19 virus running amok. Do you have any information on what's going on currently in the UK regarding Assange?
Yeah, so one of our fellow journalists, Marty Silk, who writes with the Australian Associated Press, contacted the Ministry of Justice, and they came back and they said, while it's true we're releasing some prisoners, especially people who are coming close to finishing their sentences, like 2 months away from finishing their sentences, we won't be doing that with Julian Assange because he's on remand. Remand just means that you're being detained pre-trial, right, because he's not on trial yet. He's on remand, so therefore he's not eligible for this particular scheme of early release for convicts, which is, of course, quite ironic because what that's saying is because he hasn't been convicted of a crime yet, we're not going to release him. We're only releasing some people who have been convicted of crimes. So it's that is the official position as of, last time I checked, and that information came out through. It is noteworthy that although they've announced they will release up to 4,000 prisoners, the Board of Prison Governors, which is essentially a union of all the governors of all the prisons in England and Wales, have come out with a statement saying they think this is not enough people, that the government is a welcome step, but they need much more. They're saying our facilities are not suited to implement social distancing. Just the opposite. We have 2 people, in cells, which are barely good enough for a single human being. And so we're having to put people in solitary confinement, which is bad for their mental health, even though just as part of like social isolation for the pandemic. So there's plenty of pressure that's constantly coming up from all kinds of sides, different sides, institutional as well as individual and campaigners, to get more and more prisoners released, and that includes Julian Assange. But it's also not just about Julian Assange; it's about prisoners on the whole. Right now, the government is judging, and neither is the judge.
Yeah, the horrific conditions in jails across the world. Some 4,000 inmates have temporarily been released in the UK and Wales. I am pretty certain that they're not going to let Julian Assange out of prison anytime soon. He might be the last one out. That was journalist Mohammed Almazi. You can find Mohammed on Twitter at ELMAAZI. Almazi. Mohammed, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We will be back in a minute to talk about the latest political moves by Donald J. Trump to divert blame from the ravages of the COVID-19 virus within the U.S. Spoiler alert, he's pretty good at it. Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
This is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey, everybody. My name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns. Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schleber here, kind of, sort of, with my great co-host, Jamarl Thomas. We're within miles of each other, Jamarl Thomas, but we are not within feet, sadly. Got the next story here, Jamarl. This has been a big question on my mind. When will Donald Trump pay the consequences of his inactions, and whether or not American consciousness will rise to that level? Donald Trump is doing his best, however, to pivot and distract from any truth-telling to convince the American public he's had this whole thing under control from the start. Just this last week, Jamarl highlighted Donald Trump suggested that he would consider opening up Medicare and Medicaid to more uninsured Americans as the coronavirus spreads across the U.S. At the White House briefing last Wednesday, Trump said, "It's something we're really going to look at because it doesn't seem fair. If you have it, you have a big advantage. At certain income level, you do." Yes, Donald Trump, that's the whole point of Medicare and Medicaid, giving the people the advantage of health care. This comes, of course, after Trump has long slammed Democratic proposals to expand government insurance and decided this week not to temporarily reopen the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, marketplaces to allow nearly 30 million uninsured Americans to purchase coverage during the pandemic. Trump, of course, qualified his comments by saying he wasn't committing to doing anything. Trump said, saying, "I can't commit. I have to get approval from it. I have a thing called Congress, but it's something we're going to look at, and we have been looking at it." So anytime he promises you anything, just wait for the qualifiers, or in his business, the small print at the bottom of the page. Jamarl, it's in my opinion, there's no way Donald Trump is going to willingly allow a single poor person in America to gain access to more government benefits, regardless of a pandemic or not. We heard Trump in the State of the Union address just months ago brag to standing ovations about how many people in his administration were kicked off of food benefits. So do we really think Trump is going to pass Medicare or Medicaid blocked funding for millions of Americans? Of course not, but he's doing this tactfully and playing politics against an incredibly weak Democratic Party who aren't offering their own Medicaid for all. Instead, they have sleepy Joe Biden ready to run their party into the ground, promising Medicaid for all who want it. And I can promise you, Joe Biden, during the pandemic, everybody's going to want it. But Trump can simply push this message and pretend that he somehow is the brilliant mind behind this new policy. And it works because the opposition is so incredibly weak. He can take credit for the policy statements, never do anything, then watch the opposition not do anything either. And at the end of the day, come out smelling like roses. Jamarl, in raw political terms, not in actually doing what is best for humans, it seems like this, once again, is a savvy move for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I love this, if I'm being honest. I made the argument that if Donald Trump, I've argued that if Donald Trump wants to win this election, this is the pathway to do so. Meaning he needs to do an about face. And in doing the about face, one of the good things would be Medicare for all with coronavirus. But like you said, the catch is the qualifiers. What are the guardrails on it? Are you going to say that somebody who comes into the hospital with the coronavirus and kidney failure, and the coronavirus made the kidney failure worse, and you say, look, only treat the coronavirus, the person with the kidney failure, you got to somehow parse that out. Like, how are you going to do that? If he says everybody is covered if you have the coronavirus, I don't care what other symptoms, that's one thing. And that's far better than opening up the healthcare exchanges. Now,
and Jamarl, if he's able to take I was going to say, if he's able to take it, what's so sad, I think, in America is people expect so little from the government and direct benefits.
Right.
That if he can spend the $1,200 check and that somehow comes in, like, I don't know, October at this rate, or what we're being told, and that can get spun as like the Trump check. It's the same thing with like the Obama phones. I don't know if you know about this for returning citizens. When people would return back home from prison or jail, they were given the Obama phone so they could make basic phone calls for job interviews, get a hold of people, their family. It was a huge thing for people to just have basic access to a phone to just live their lives and reintegrate into society. But it wasn't a house, it wasn't a job, it wasn't like a meal program or counseling or anything. But Barack Obama, within certain communities at that moment, just gave people a simple phone, and that scored him huge points. So Donald Trump doesn't actually need to do anything like, he's not going to do anything like monumentous around Medicaid, but he can just give people the tiniest little bit of something, and people will love it more than anything the Democrats are openly giving them right now.
It's so dispiriting, isn't it? It really is. I mean, honestly, this race, God, you have no idea the level of cynicism this race has instilled in me. The Bernie Sanders runs and viable candidate on the left, and he puts out all of these policies. And the American public looks at these policies and says, yes, we like these. We love these policies. We agree with these policies. Good God, we've been waiting for somebody to put out these policies. And then they say, but we're going to go Joe Biden. And you look at this like, what? How are you doing? How are you doing this? How are you making this choice? Somebody is here making an argument for your material needs that is in your interest that you fundamentally agree with. And they would say, but that doesn't seem viable in regards to getting elected and getting passed. Because in their consciousness over the last 50 years, the Democratic Party has been so miserly and ineffective that what they consider to be normal is it's Joe Biden basically offering nothing. Like, God, that's so dispiriting. And when you get to the Trump check, $1,200 that they're going to get in like August, even though their rents are due right now, and they're going to be like, oh, thank God Trump sent me that check. It's like so menial. It's so deadened in regards to expectations and imaginations of what your political system or what your government can do if it's marshaled with a certain degree of intention. And unfortunately, that's not where we are.
But Jamar, I think it's even worse than Joe Biden offering nothing. Joe Biden is offering horrible policy. And I think that's what Donald Trump is realizing. Think about marijuana legalization. Joe Biden is saying marijuana is a gateway drug. He's not saying I'm just against legalization. I'm not for it. I'm kind of for it. I'm for it at a state level. It's going to kind of happen, or not take a position at all. It's a medicine. Out of all of the positions he could take, he picks it's a gateway drug. Like we learned that a long time ago. It's a medicine. It might be abused by people, but it's not a gateway drug into like meth or heroin or whatever he thinks it is. And that for me makes it even worse because Donald Trump just has to even say, oh, I'm for states' rights. If each state wants to pass it, go for it. Cool. And that's going to gain him more support of people that might just be single issue marijuana legalization voters than Joe Biden's going to get. And Joe Biden's going to lose that across the board with just really boring, and if I can say lame policy.
But that's my point about the left, that for the last 40 years, look, I've said it before, I want ruthless, radical devotion to getting a particular thing accomplished. That's what I want. You're in a game space and you have this massive objective in regards to the things that you want to get accomplished. You have 500,000 people losing their health care. People, 70% of the country live in paycheck to paycheck. I mean, persistently vulnerable human beings. What is the level of stress that we put on our human beings? We don't invest in resources into regards to the people themselves, into the communities. And I ask, why is that okay? And if you are running on the left, that should be like burns in you, meaning
I hear you. I hear you completely. And I think this might be a good conversation for Fight Me or Come At Me Bro Friday. But for me, the issue that should have been ran with on the left was reparations. It started out polling at 24%. So if you talk about a radical commitment to get something done that's never been done before, to create that conversation, which is focused on class and redistribution of wealth to those who are oppressed with a racial angle to it, which easily and quickly benefits every poor white person in the country. That was the conversation for me that nobody grabbed onto and was missed. So I agree with you. We need radical, bold, slingshot to the moon types policies that I'm not seeing right now. Even from Bernie Sanders, who the stuff is good, but it's still not that kind of slingshot way out of left field that catapults into main discourse that creates a move.
That's going to be a Come At Me Bro segment. I disagree with you on it. I think I disagree with you on that.
I knew when I said it, I was going to disagree.
You have to deal with people where they are. And Sanders, I mean, you're in a country that, for the most part, was the number one thing against socialism and communism. And this guy's called himself a socialist. And the policies, like you said, they're not radical. They're just rational, pragmatic policy. And so, I don't know. I mean, getting the rational, pragmatic, like you say, you've made the argument before that getting stuff done allows people to realize that something else is possible.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's wrong starting at a particular point.
Yeah, I hear you on the
segment. Yes.
I think it is good because, again, hindsight's 20/20. Bernie Sanders isn't in first place right now, and the banks are robbing people once again, so we might as well throw out any radical idea. We'll save it for Friday. So first, we're going to take a quick break here before coming back with show favorite, Anya Prampil, an independent journalist with the Gray Zone, to talk about Venezuela and, of course, Joe Rogan. Bizarre, I would say those two things in the same sentence. Later in the hour, maybe my favorite weekly segment, This the Press. You are listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We're back after this.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas, here with my indomitable co-host, Bob Schlehuber. Let's keep doing the news. Lots to cover over the next hour, including the hubbub over the weekend about Joe Rogan saying he would back Trump over one Joe Biden. Of course, the person that gets attacked in all of this becomes Sanders, for accepting the Joe Rogan endorsement. Instead of attacking Sanders, they should be concerned that a lefty like Joe Rogan will be on his platform ragging on Biden, but that lefty would have backed Sanders. As always, we want to hear from you. You can call us at 202-521-1320 and tweet us at Sputnik Misfits. Give us a like if you're digging what we're putting down and share the video. Well, let's start with Venezuela. At the end of March, the United States indicted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and other current and former members of the Venezuelan government on drug trafficking charges, saying the indictments resulted from a years-long investigation, etc., etc. I don't recall any mention of the COVID-19 pandemic in connection with those indictments, but in keeping with Washington's policy of throwing whatever it can in Venezuela and seeing what sticks, that soon came up. A few days later, Trump announced that he was going to be sending more warships and aircraft to the Caribbean, doubling the U.S. military presence there to prevent drug cartels, presumably from working with Maduro's government to prevent it from using the pandemic to do more of that alleged drug smuggling. Now, however, Newsweek is reporting that that's all nonsense, and this plan to begin military pressure on Venezuela has been in the works for months. Wag the dog. This is Newsweek, of course, and they're calling only anonymous sources, but let's go through the story nonetheless. Their sources are saying, look, this plan has been in the works for months, and the public wasn't supposed to know about it until May. It's being used to redirect the attention from the pandemic, which I can't say seems to be working. It's not like the papers are full of headlines about foreign policy right now. But the administration is using the pandemic to cover in every way possible, using it to cover the pandemic every way possible. First, the military buildup was supposed to prevent our non-empty streets from being awash with Caribbean drugs. Then it was to prevent the virus from being carried along with drug shipments. Pretty soon, it'll be that the Venezuelans have developed COVID-19 in a lab, or the Venezuela is harboring a secret cure. Right. We're joined by Anya Prampil, independent journalist with The Gray Zone, to update our situation. Anya, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm great. Good to be with you guys. How are you guys doing?
We're doing all right. Hunkered down, a little bit of cabin fever, but everything is all right. I suppose that's better than the COVID-19. So can you give us an update on what's going on? The United States military is threatening a buildup or is building up around Venezuela, and what the Venezuelan response has been to that buildup?
People in Venezuela who I speak with are saying that this is not the first time they felt they've been used by the U.S. government as kind of a punching bag to distract from failures occurring within the United States. And it's not the first time the United States has taken direct action against Venezuela that could easily be interpreted as the first move in a military war. For example, in February of last year, the United States actually attempted to invade Venezuela. We forget, but that's what they tried to do with that failed aid delivery, which they tried to push through the Colombian border and was eventually set on fire by U.S. supported thugs on the Colombian side. If you remember that story from last year, it was eventually even confirmed by the New York Times that the Venezuelan military didn't attack that aid convoy, that it was actually people on the Colombian side responsible for sabotaging it. But that was an attempted invasion of Venezuela. Sanctions are an act of war. Those are also something that should be considered a wartime aggression that the United States has instigated against Venezuela. And so this is just another step that you could add to a list of aggressions the United States has taken against this country. And it's already had pretty frightening consequences. I agree with you that this should be a major story in U.S. media right now, not only the fact that the United States is sending warships to Venezuela through the Caribbean, but we've actually already seen a Venezuelan naval ship sunk over the last week. And I want to get into the details of this story because I think it's quite remarkable that it's been overlooked by the media. Reports surfaced last Wednesday, I believe. I saw the report in the Jerusalem Post. It was this very strange article, one of the strangest I've ever read, a story which said a German cruise ship with a Portuguese flag, flying under the Portuguese flag, but with no passengers on board. It said that the Venezuelan Navy had fired on this ship to exit its waters before capsizing. They said the Venezuelan naval boat just capsized for some reason after it rammed in to this German Portuguese cruise ship, which was just such a bizarre story. It didn't really make sense. The Venezuelan military released a statement saying that it was acting in self-defense and that actually the German cruise boat had moved to sink its naval boat. And then on Saturday, the Venezuelan Armed Forces actually released video of this incident, which I encourage people to go find. It's on my Twitter account. But what happened pretty clearly from this video, there's audio recording of the exchange between the ships, and there's video of the moment the Portuguese ship actually rammed itself into this small Venezuelan Coast Guard boat. And what happened was, it seems as though this Portuguese cruise ship crossed into Venezuelan waters, perhaps by mistake, and it was headed towards a port that is off the coast of Venezuela. It's in a Dutch island chain, so it's essentially it is a port controlled by NATO. And this ship comes along in Venezuelan waters, pursuing a direction that gives Venezuela jurisdiction and the right to question the people on board. And they had asked the ship to dock in an island off the coast of Venezuela, a Venezuelan island named Margarita Island. And after the Portuguese ship refused to dock, they said, "Oh, we had no idea we were in waters under your jurisdiction. We're so sorry." It just rammed into the Venezuelan boat. It directly hits it, and it's this boat. The German boat was made to tear through Arctic waters. It's like steel all on its hub. It's meant to smash through icebergs. And so it smashes into this Venezuelan little Coast Guard boat, which sinks, and the Venezuelan soldiers are left in the water to drown and are fortunately rescued by compatriots. And this story has just gotten no attention, even though I see it as a result, a direct result of the U.S. escalation in the region. And it's also, we should be asking questions. If this story were actually being covered more, we should be asking what that ship was doing. Why were there only 33 people on this massive cruise ship? What was its purpose? What was on board? Why didn't they want to be inspected? I've heard theories thrown out there from people in Venezuela that there could have been mercenaries or drugs, weapons, a number of things on board. For some reason, they didn't want Venezuelan authorities to see. So it's very scary. I think the reason a lot of people commented on the video when I shared it and said, why didn't Venezuela fire on this ship? As you see it just ramming into their boat. And I think they were so scared of starting a war that they actually sat there and got sunk. It's pretty disturbing. And I don't know which is more disturbing, the fact that this isn't happening or the fact that it's not huge news in the United States.
But the boat that get hit, there were people on the boat that rammed the other boat. Did the boat sink where they couldn't necessarily inspect the boat after the accident?
No, the other boat just sailed away. It continued on its course. So it was able to just avoid any sort of inspection. And the other ship was so fortified and strong that it didn't seem to have any severe damage. I mean, you can watch this video. I encourage people to do that because it's very shocking. I can't almost describe it, except it's terrifying. You see this massive, huge cruise ship just hitting the side of this little Venezuelan boat. It seems kind of like a nightmare. If you were on board, you see the water filling up all around the soldiers, or the sailors, I should say, and they're panicking. So it's pretty freaky.
Wow, that is horrendous. That's rough. So to move on slightly from this, you recently spoke with Pino Alarchi,
yes,
former Director General of the United Nations Office of Vienna and Executive Director of the Office of Drug Control and Prevention. What was his take on the accusations against the Venezuelan government by the Trump administration?
He was fascinated because this is someone who, yes, ran the Office for Drug Control and Prevention at the United Nations. And he said he was assisted by the Trump administration to announce these charges against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. He said in his 40 years in anti-drug work, he never visited Venezuela because there was never a reason to. In our interview, he says, everyone in Colombia and Bolivia, Peru, they know me because I've been there many times. They're involved in the drug trade. Venezuela's not. If anybody's been to Venezuela, they'll know that you can't, for example, just find cocoa leaves or products in Venezuela the way you could, for example, in Ecuador or Colombia, because there aren't cocoa plants. It doesn't make sense that cocoa would be harvested and produced in Colombia and then for some reason shipped to Venezuela and from there to the United States. It follows a route, and Mr. Arlaki described it for me. It's a route that we're all familiar with from Colombia, Bolivia, through Central American countries such as Honduras, which we know is a major U.S. ally and stepping stone in the drug trade. The Honduran president, who's serving an illegal, unconstitutional second term, Juan Orlando Hernandez, his brother was actually charged and found guilty in a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking case last year, and the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was named as a co-conspirator in that case and accused of funding his political campaign with drug money. So there's another stepping stone in the drug trade, and then it comes up through Mexico, through the organized crime units in Mexico, the cartels which distribute the drugs ultimately across the border in the United States. So I confirmed what many of us thought when we saw these charges, which was that there is no evidence to support them. And in my interview with Mr. Arlaki, he says, out of all the reports that have been produced by the UN Anti-Drug Office, Venezuela is never mentioned. It wasn't mentioned once in the most recent report. So there's really no way to make this case against the Venezuelan president, except that the United States is trying to stage for, it seems like, a Panama-style intervention in Venezuela, which is really scary when we see all of the posturing that's already come and the dangerous impact it's had. It's very worrying, and so we shouldn't take our attention off of Venezuela just in this moment of coronavirus because it certainly seems like there are forces ready to exploit it.
Speaking of the coronavirus, what's happening there on the ground regarding the virus itself? Venezuela, similar to Iran, is under heavy sanctions. What has been, I guess you can say, what's it like from a person view on the ground in Venezuela right now?
Well, I've asked people there. I haven't been since the outbreak of coronavirus. And in some ways, it seems as though Venezuela is better equipped to handle this crisis than, say, for example, Ecuador and Brazil, where they've seen just terrible breakouts with people, for example, bodies piling up in the street in Ecuador. They have nowhere to put them. And that's because there is a very strong sense of collective responsibility in a place like Venezuela. And so they've implemented really strict travel measures and restrictions, stay-at-home orders all across the country because they were definitely afraid of a breakout because their healthcare system would not be able to handle it. Because their healthcare system, as you point out, is under such heavy sanction that we already knew before this coronavirus outbreak that excess deaths were occurring. Tens of thousands of excess deaths were occurring in Venezuela, are occurring in Venezuela every year as a result of those sanctions. So they rightfully responded, I think, before they had a major breakout and were able to put in some measures to kind of mitigate the outbreak. And that's been the case so far. I don't have the exact numbers, but they have had a few deaths and a few cases, but nowhere on the scale as Brazil, Ecuador, even the United States, because they implemented these strict stay-at-home measures. And that's something that, for example, Dr. Bruce Alward at the World Health Organization praised China for. And something he noted was that this collective responsibility, this mentality where you actually have to take care of your neighbor, even if it means inconveniencing yourself and staying home, not going out and doing whatever you want, which is kind of U.S. mentality where people are rebelling against these stay-at-home orders and saying, well, this goes against my personal freedom and I'm going to go gather with people if I want to because I'm a freedom-loving American. So I think there is something to be said for the ability of places like Venezuela to respond to the crisis in spite of sanctions. They also have a weaker healthcare system than, say, Iran or Cuba because they haven't been under the same level of sanctions for decades and decades that Iran and Cuba have, which have allowed them to even develop more independent health sectors. But Venezuela is in the early stages of doing that. All throughout last year, we heard about agreements being made between the Russian pharmaceutical companies, for example, saying that they were coming to Venezuela to start a production of necessary medications. So they are taking those steps in Venezuela to improve their health system. And at the moment, we can say that coronavirus hasn't taken a deadly toll in Venezuela the way that we've seen in the region. And in Iran, unfortunately, Iran really seems to be hit the hardest by this outbreak.
Yeah, and Anya, for me, it just really speaks to the volumes of how poor people in the United States, oppressed people, people of color, share way more in common with people around the world that are living under the thumb of U.S. imperialism. I mean, we're seeing in New York right now temporary burials of people. We're seeing from cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, Washington, D.C. here significantly higher rates of death than of Black people and of poor people that they are proportionally in societies. We talk a lot here on Political Misfits about there being some type of class revolution or organizing opportunities that may come out of the COVID-19 pandemic. But Anya, shouldn't we turn that same kind of thought towards internationalism and the potential of poor people and people oppressed around the world trying to find each other, even though they're going to be hit the hardest by this pandemic?
Absolutely. I think the two issues, the domestic organizing, can't be separate from the international side, or the international struggle, I should say. One of my favorite things to say when I go to places like Venezuela or Syria, or when I go speak about them throughout the United States, is exactly what you just laid out, Bob, which is that the struggle is the same. Whether you're living in Baltimore or Detroit or Caracas or Tehran, you share a common enemy, which are the elite, the ruling class of the United States, which would rather take all of the wealth of this country and invest it into exploiting countries abroad for their wealth and their resources and just keeping it all controlled at the very top. And so we at the bottom are left to fight for the scraps, and we also are living under the same repressive, in many cases, in many U.S. cities, under the same militaristic thumb that people abroad are faced with. That's why you have people like for mayor, presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg running around posting pictures of himself in his U.S. military uniform with his gun and saying, this gun is only supposed to be carried in the Middle East, not here in the United States. But in reality, it makes sense that both of those weapons would be used against poor people here or between people here with this violent culture we have that kind of encourages the phenomenon of mass shootings the way we don't see in any other country. But I think you have to emphasize this is the perfect moment for organizing in the United States and making the connection between the suffering faced by the working class, which is being completely left to die during this crisis. Our government, it feels like, did the least to protect its people or respond to the crisis. When you look at anyone in the world, that's why we have the highest rate. We have to ask, why is it that the wealthiest country in the world also has the highest infection rate or death rate? Coronavirus competes with other nations that are at least trying. It felt like we've yet to see any effort from our government to curb the deadly effects of.
Well, I agree with you, but why does the left keep losing this argument? That's my question. I mean, I've covered politics for a while, and I've started to zero in on historical reference and this connection between history versus politics, and I've always hit my head on this question of why are people voting against their material interests? In one part, I come down to, well, people just don't know any better. I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. I just mean people are brought up in a particular system that they buy into, don't necessarily question that much, and think it's kind of like a fish in water, that this is just the way things are, not necessarily that this is the system that they're acting in. But you make the argument to them and say, look, things don't necessarily have to be this way. Even if you don't want to get rid of capitalism, you can make alterations that make your material life better. Shouldn't this country work to the benefit of the people who are effectively creating the wealth of this particular country? And to me, that's the most rational, sensible argument in the world. And yet, year after year after year, the left loses that argument. You get a candidate like Sanders in this race who makes that argument, and they say, yes, we agree. And then they go and vote for Joe Biden. So why on earth does the left persistently lose this argument? How, at some point, does the left get this across? I'm thinking of this in context of the autopsy of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
What does it need? What needs to happen for the left to win this?
Well, I think Sanders was part of the way the left, whatever that means, in the United States ultimately does win the argument. I think the popularity of Sanders shows that this country is ripe for serious change. It wasn't going to come with Sanders, unfortunately. I think a lot of people could have guessed that. Part of it, I think, is the campaign he ran. This time around, we can get into the details there, but we also all know that the system is rigged against him because of its very nature. But at the very least, people, through his candidacy, started to think about that. And I think it's something that won't be undone, especially as we prepare to face, I think, will be an unprecedented economic collapse to come from COVID, something that many people in their lifetimes have never experienced before on this level, I think will come, and it'll only encourage a conversation similar to what you described. How do people start, how do candidates run and actually support issues that people want? We shouldn't be talking. We can segue, I guess, into Joe Rogan, since that's something you wanted to talk about. I think this whole scandal or fake scandal over his Trump endorsement or suggestion that he vote for Trump over the weekend is the perfect encapsulation of the way the elite are all melting down, shows you how disconnected they are and how little they understand about the populace, the voting populace. But his whole attitude toward the election, I think, is going to reflect a lot of people's attitude, and it's really kind of reflects the disenfranchisement. I don't think Joe Rogan wants to vote for Trump, but he doesn't really see another option, and a lot of people will feel that way. So it's only creating the conditions for something else to emerge, and it's got to come from outside of the Democratic Party. I think it's even almost got to come from outside of the acknowledged electoral system, but who knows what it will be. There could be a movement to come from all of this.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think, Jamal, talking about what's happening in the United Kingdom, which I think is very similar here in the United States, is that these policies are overwhelmingly polling well with the populace. But I don't think you have enough mass education happening. There's a lot of people, a lot of young people that will be energized for Bernie Sanders. They're willing to promote him on Twitter and on Facebook and social media. But I don't think enough of those people are going out door to door and doing the small 20, 30-person meetings and those long education nights. There's a lot of people doing that here in the United States, but not a critical mass of people that would need to sweep over. And then at the same time, just history of repression when these groups don't have the material resources to just book a room in Washington, D.C. to reserve a room to get people in. It costs money. To get food at the meeting costs money. To get babysitting costs money. To get translators, interpreters, that costs money. So the expense of actually mobilizing a mass education political movement is incredibly difficult to do. And I think that's where Joe Rogan has said, I think he's kind of figured out some of those things of saying, people are upset. They either don't know what's going on, they kind of know what's going on, but they've been screwed over when it comes to material resources. And there's an anger to that I think is righteous and correct. Where it then aims itself, how it engages politically, I don't think there's much leadership. I'm not looking for Joe Rogan's endorsement to influence my own personal political decisions. A lot of people are. I'll disagree with him being maybe the best role model for that, but just to simply dismiss him and then somehow make it a slur on Sanders, Jamal, to me is it's bizarre, and it's more of just establishment, moderate neoliberalism forces at play.
Well, it's more than bizarre, right? You need those people to vote for you. I mean, let's put this in real terms. Joe Biden is getting 24% popularity in regards to people who are enthusiastic about him. Hillary Clinton and all of these other people had lower, and they lost. And so you have this really bizarre situation where these guys who are basically attacking Rogan is a lefty, believe it or not. That's the wild part about this. Anya, how are they planning to win this race when they can't get, basically they're vilifying lefties while they're needing these lefties in order to get elected? Is this just one of those things where they just know the thing that they're not saying out loud is that Joe Biden is going to take an L to Donald Trump, and so we don't really care about trying to get the lefties on board?
I almost have a theory, and I do have a theory. I feel as though they aren't planning to win. Part of me actually thinks the Democratic Party is very happy being a permanent opposition party to Donald Trump. They don't want to govern. I don't think they want to, because then they have to start telling people why are the Democrats in charge and we're not giving people Medicare for all? Why aren't we putting in any of these progressive policies that we know our base would like? What is our excuse? I think they'd much rather spend the next 4 years making up another Ukraine gate or Russia gate and having all these political show trials on Capitol Hill. I think they'd rather do that and raise a bunch of money off of the Trump presidency than actually have to govern. That's partially.
So I'm going to introduce a slightly different theory. I think of this in terms of the Matrix, where Neo is having, I think of all these terms in terms of comic books and movies. But in terms of Matrix, where Neo is having an argument with one of the computers or whatever, and they make the point to him that there are levels of existence that we are willing to accept. Meaning we're willing to torch it all if you are going to do X, and meaning that's their way of trying to compel him to take a particular position. The Democratic Party understood that if Sanders takes it, they've lost the party for a generation. Meaning between losing to Donald Trump and having Sanders win it, because I think their issue is he could win, they would prefer Biden. We'll take the loss of Biden and retain power, as opposed to having Sanders fundamentally reshape what this party is and what this party does for a generation. That's my thought on it.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think they would rather have another 4 years of Trump than a Sanders presidency. And at this point, I think they'd even rather have 4 more years of Trump than anyone. What is a Democrat going to do? What do Democrats have left to give us if they're in office at this point. They're just going to spend, Obama, it feels like, was the culmination of the last of democratic energy after the deregulation of the financial crisis and all the policies that Clinton implemented that kind of shifted from the traditional Democratic Party role. And then Obama comes in promising to be this progressive, hopeful change person that we all want, that an entire generation and supposed political base in this country wants, and he can't deliver on any of it because the Democratic Party, it's reached a point of just there's no reason. Like, what is it going to give us? What is it going to give anyone? It can't even really articulate.
It's going to give us. No, I mean it's going to give us stuff. It's going to give us like Michael Bloomberg. Like Michael Bloomberg was more acceptable of an endorsement to a party than Joe Rogan is, one of the most popular kind of podcast figures, socio-economic class of people who has a huge megaphone. That's not allowed at all. But the person that is allowed is Mike Bloomberg, Anya. And that's what's wild to me is like they keep on, that's what their new offerings are, the Mike Bloombergs of the world.
Exactly. That should tell us everything we need to know about the Democratic Party. It really isn't at this point any different from the Republican Party. It's just a false branch of it that exists to make us feel like we're running an election every 4 years. I mean, I hate to sound like this. I'm introducing the whole cliche two-party system. We know that. We've known that for a long time, but it's just more pronounced now that we can actually, the Democrats, thinking that we're so, that like their base, they loathe their base so much that they expect them to vote for Joe Biden.
Yeah, Anya, you're on Political Misfits. Don't worry. You fit in here with us. We hear you loudly, and we greatly appreciate you. That was Anya Prampil, independent journalist with the Gray Zone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. I love the show.
Great. We hope to have you back on soon. Next is Miss the Press as America prepares for its Pearl Harbor moment. Political Misfits, Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
Look, up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's a Tic Tac UFO, man. Just like the one the U.S. Navy caught on video in 2004, but only came clean about it last year. No, I'm pretty sure it was a bird.
Whatever. Get nerdy on Wednesdays with Revelations. The Political Misfits look into the world's mysteries and a lot of UFO stuff.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamal Thomas. Time for our weekly Miss the Press segment, where we take a look at the worst interviews from America's Sunday talk shows and some of the abhorrent, unchecked answers from America's political figures. Jamal, we start with the big headline of the weekend, which is the high death toll Americans are expecting over the next few weeks from COVID-19. U.S. State Surgeon General Jerome Adams hit most of the Sunday talk shows with the following message. Here's the worst of them from all. Chuck Todd on Meet the Press asking Adams what he would tell the 9 governors in the United States that have yet to declare some sort of stay-at-home order, and telling us a little bit more about what Americans should expect over the next week. Here's Chuck Todd on Meet the Press and Jerome Adams, the U.S. Surgeon General's response.
Here's what I say to them. Here's what I would say to them right now. The next week is going to be our Pearl Harbor moment. It's going to be our 9/11 moment. It's going to be the hardest moment for many Americans in their entire lives. And we really need to understand that if we want to flatten that curve and get through to the other side, everyone needs to do their part.
Jamal, I understand the usage of Pearl Harbor and 9/11 here. It is to give Americans a sense of what they are about to face in historical terms, of the impact and what we as a nation will forever remember. That seems clear with what is about to take place over the next weeks. But for me, when I heard this the first time, and it was played on almost every Sunday talk show, or at least on the cable news networks at some point over the weekend, when I heard 9/11, I thought of lessons learned from the attacks on this country, that American imperialism, that American exceptionalism, that global American greed would have consequences and blowback. 9/11, for me, made it clear that our fighting enemies abroad and invading countries had consequences to the masses of Americans here at home. So over the next weeks, when we still see what happens to the masses of Americans, what we see happen to the millions of Americans, when we let our government invest more in imperialism, more in militarism, more in global capitalistic greed, that is how the next weeks for me relate to 9/11. But surely this isn't what the Surgeon General nor Chuck Todd were referring to, Jamal, when they were invoking Pearl Harbor and 9/11.
Of course not. Chalmers Johnson has a book called Blowback, and he makes the exact point that you just made. When we got hit on 9/11, they weren't entirely sure who did it. It was this kind of thing because functionally, the United States have been invading countries, putting in dictators, killing various leaders in these other countries, especially in South America. And you created so many enemies abroad that you get hit. Now, the problem is we didn't necessarily ask why we were hit in honest terms, because again, we're exceptional and we were around the world. We're doing it for freedom and democracy. So, there's that. But calling this 9/11 kind of misses the point that 9/11 that wasn't necessarily something that we were just standing here not doing anything and got hit. This is a little bit different. This is not us not investing resources into our country, especially in the medical system, and through greed alone, ignoring things like vaccines and masks and ventilators because those things weren't profitable. That's what it boils down to, Bob.
Yeah, and for me, 9/11 was preventable if you didn't take the foreign policy position the United States had laid out around the world. That aggression and the response and the blowback may not have happened. And I think the same thing we're seeing now, even in the global response, the way in which we bully and threaten other countries over capital and power to get face masks, to get protective gear that we're seeing the U.S. direct now and demand from around the world. When you see all of that take place, and that's the relationship you decide to have with the world, an America first model, you're going to have these 9/11 or COVID-19 pandemics rip across your country. And for me, I think that's what's need to be reminded and really drawn forward the next week. Jamal, I have one more clip here for you. Fox News Sunday, again, with the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, talking about how diseases do not respect borders and how in the U.S. there should be one overall guidance. However, small hiccup here, due to federalism, we must respect states' rights even if more people die. I'm obviously paraphrasing a bit here, Jamal, but you'll hear it yourself if you listen between the lines. Here's Jerome Adams giving a response to host Chris Wallace on whether or not the remaining states in the United States should issue stay-at-home orders.
Diseases don't respect state lines, but we live in a country where we have a system of federalism. And when it comes to opioids, states have different rules and regulations and laws regarding treatment, regarding syringe service programs, as you and I have talked about. I actually put out a report on tobacco cessation earlier this year, and we know that states have different laws there, and more people will die, even in the worst projections, from cigarette smoking in this country than are going to die from coronavirus this year. And so we always are struggling with trying to get information out to guide people that we know will help them be healthy with states' rights.
States' rights, Jamal, states' rights. Remind you now that Surgeon General Adams was previously appointed to Indiana State Health Commissioner when Mike Pence was governor of that state. Adams and Pence were criticized for their handling of HIV outbreak in Indiana by resisting needle exchanges, a move that some estimate increased HIV rates by 50%. So great work there at the state level, Team Pence-Adams. This for me, Jamal, highlights America's obsession with rugged individualism and this idea that we should each individually be empowered to make our own decisions in our lives, states' rights. This idea of individualism is completely insane, given we live in an interconnected system, systems that are highlighted by the system failures we are now seeing across the board. It also speaks volumes to me, Jamal, that many Americans, and obviously this administration, is obsessed with borders and walls, when in reality, the largest threats facing humankind is climate crisis, as well as a global health pandemic. Global health pandemics have no care for the borders and walls we continue to build, neither does the environment. And the obsession with borders at the expense of people's lives, Jamal, is disgusting. We just simply are not prepared for the next decade's biggest challenges, at least here in the United States. We are wholly unprepared, Jamal.
I'd take a slightly different argument. I would slightly argue that it's an issue of ideology, meaning people are brought up in a system with a particular way of thinking about the world, and that particular way of thinking about the world run up against reality. Now, in this particular sense, the reality is borders are not real things. That pandemic doesn't necessarily respect borders because it's not a real thing. It has no idea what a border is because that border doesn't really exist. And so we, ideologically bound, look at it from state to state to state, coming up with different policies, as opposed to having a united policy dealing with this particular issue. I would even argue that it gets to this notion of, like you said, rugged individualism, or this notion of capitalism, or what government, or for that matter, what you as a person and what society by extension should be doing. Should it be investing in resources of healthcare? Should it be invested in scientists? Should it be invested in education? Should it be invested in issues of war? Meaning, if you're spending $1 trillion on your military and you need the Russian government to give you supplies, I would put to you that your priorities are wrong. And if your priorities are wrong, what has your society been focusing on to end up in a situation where your priorities get you to the point where you need Russia, a government that is nowhere near as wealthy as the United States, offering and giving you supplies because you can't supply those things for yourself? Like, something is wrong in the very fabric and the way that people think about their world to allow something like this to take place. That's my only thought on it. Yeah.
Yeah, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. And Jamal, when I heard it, that kind of thing of like, yeah, would it be best if we kind of took a national tack for this right now? Would it save the most lives? Would that remaining 10% of Americans in those 9 states be best if they follow some type of stay-at-home order like all the other states? Of course, Jamal. Are we going to do that? Nah, we're good. We're America. And that was the same thing. Joe Biden, the same thing, like Medicaid for all. Of course, that would be good for everyone. But this is America. We don't do it. We don't do what those other countries do, like have improved health services for less money. This is America. And that's the same thing I'm hearing from both parties right now.
It's an astonishing position, right? Yeah. My litmus test is Medicare for all. If Joe Biden came out and says, I'm pushing for Medicare for all, and I believed him, like he credibly went that way, Joe Biden would get my vote. Joe Biden would never do that. Like, even though it's popular, even though the majority of the public is for it, the overwhelming majority of Democrats, you're talking about like 70% is for it. And he's still like, nope, I'm not for it. Like, that's an astonishing position in the middle of a pandemic where millions of people have just lost their health care.
And that'll be kind of my other thing with it. It will be really interesting again as this thing plays out. We're seeing kind of the interconnectedness of the world play out. We're seeing more and more people realizing that they're going through shared experiences. The world's going to experience a pandemic that hits many different people differently, but it's going to be this global shared experience. In many ways, it's like the scenarios of aliens attacked Earth and the world had to come together to fight it. Like, the world's not doing that very well. They're obviously fighting over it, but at the end of this thing, if there's an end to this thing, we'll all have just experienced this pretty historical thing as a globe. And so I wonder if that will open up any conversations or spaces around this rapid push around the world to build more and more borders and walls. I mean, the rapid development of borders across the world the last 40 years has been astonishing since the end of the Cold War. It's been kind of this misnomer that because the Berlin Wall came down, less walls went up, more have come up, Jamal. So I wonder, do you think there'll be kind of a historical legacy to this global unifying event, or will we just kind of reset to where we've been?
You know, that's an interesting question. I mean, because we're forced to kind of work together. Like, the whole notion of social distancing and everything else, that's a collective process. I mean, all of us to some degree have to think of ourselves as, all right, we're doing this for the larger society. So I don't know. I mean, maybe just from that standpoint alone. I mean, do you think that's enough to get people in the mindset that, hey, we can work together when there's something that goes beyond our typical daily experience?
Yeah, I mean, to share the title of one of my favorite shows, Together Alone, is bizarre, right? We're collectively working together at being apart from one another. I think there'll be some things that come from it when it comes just to systems. I mean, you'll have now shown global health systems that are going to be rapidly built. We're seeing more communication between people at local levels be built out, and I think we'll see more of that globally. The question, though, is if people are able to organize without those resources when their communities that have been historically oppressed are under more distress, as we're seeing the impacts of COVID-19 hit poor people the hardest. I mean, what was it, 1 million deaths in India, possibly? I promise you those are in the slums and poor areas of that country. We're also seeing in Greece, as they have to start quarantining more of their migrant camps, as more people from Afghanistan and other regions have carried the disease along the route to those refugee camps. So I think there will be a lasting legacy, but again, is it just the silencing of those who are most impacted, or some type of broader organizing effort rises out of it? And I think it's just much too early to figure out if that will happen or not.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Agree. Totally agree. Yeah.
Well, since we are agreeing, let's take a break so we can get back to maybe some disagreeing. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. You have been listening to Political Misfits weekly Monday segment, Miss the Press. As always,
you check tab.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaber here with Jamarl Thomas. A few stories we want to fit in so we do not miss anything here on Monday, April 6th. Tomorrow, that Navy captain being hailed as a hero for trying to protect his crew as a virus tore through his ship is now sick himself, according to an MSN story. Brett Crozier was sacked after a letter he wrote to Navy commanders was leaked to the press. In it, he detailed the service's failure to protect its sailors and called for drastic action. There were moving clips of his crew cheering him as he left the ship after he was relieved of duty. Now his family says he's showing signs of the illness, just as many of his fellow sailors were. After that, let me emphasize this here. He's getting zero sympathy whatsoever from the Pentagon. They are irate. Thomas Modly, the acting secretary of the Navy, told the crew aboard the USS Teddy Roosevelt that their former commander, Captain Brett Crozier, was either too naive or too stupid to be in command, or that he intentionally leaked to media a memo in which he warned about coronavirus spreading aboard the aircraft carrier and urged action to save his sailors. Modly went on to say it was a betrayal, and I can tell you one other thing, because he did that, he put in the public's forum, and now it's a big controversy in Washington, D.C. Jamarl, obviously the military prides itself on the hierarchy of command, that no one steps out of order. If you did step out of order, you're unable to allow people to be controlling you. It seems like what the Navy commander did was an affront to the overall structure of U.S. militarism. Am I wrong here, Jamal, that the military, in an effort to preserve its hierarchy and control over its rank and file, are willing to let people die on ships like this as COVID-19 continues to rip through the U.S. military?
Yeah, they were embarrassed. Now think about this in the context of FISA courts, meaning secret courts, and the things that take place in regards to what they do, and the secrecy, meaning there's no transparency in the process. They do whatever they want. Well, you have this military situation where this particular guy literally said, my crew is going to get sick. And they attacked him for basically pointing out, I don't want my crew to get ill with this particular virus. And they attacked him for that. You know what I mean? Like, it's so bizarre. It's this kind of weird world where the person who does the right thing is not necessarily the person that gets prized. What is the incentive in this process if you're going to basically attack the person for trying to save his crew? It's so strange.
Yeah. I mean, I think of loud and clear co-host here on Radio Sputnik, John Kiriakou, the famed CIA whistleblower. Again, you're saying to yourself, this person is trying to save lives. He's trying to uphold the values that are professed by the U.S. military. He goes and does what he is told is right. And here you are as a commander. You're told your fellow soldier, your person next to you, that is you. You look like them. You dress like them. You do everything you can to protect them like the most loved one that you possibly had. And he basically says, look, I wasn't getting the support and help I needed from the Pentagon. And so he leaked the memo and finally got the globe's attention, or at least America's attention, Pentagon's attention on these issues. And there he is again, slapped on the wrist and then moved off of the ship immediately.
That's horrendous. Honestly, that's really horrendous. I mean, I'm curious how the public perceives him as opposed to the way the military is perceiving him. And like you say, he's getting no love for the military, and now he's showing symptoms of the illness that he was effectively trying to warn his crew about. I mean, what was he supposed to do in the situation? Like what's the moral action of an individual, or an action of integrity that the individual was supposed to do in that particular situation? And I think he took it. I mean, what else he was supposed to, it's like, what else do you expect of the person? He wanted to get the word out that we are going to get ill. All of these people are going to get sick. We got to do something about it. And they ignored him.
Yeah. And it speaks to kind of the hierarchy, too, of Washington, D.C., this acting naval Modley basically complaining, how dare you make a stir of things for us in Washington, D.C. And the elites here, the military industrial complex here, the politicians and the lobbyists that are benefiting off of the military, if people across the United States actually heard true stories from what were happening, and people try to tell those stories, to Chelsea Mannings, the Edward Snowdens, they try to tell the stories of what is happening around the world. Their biggest fear are more and more of those stories being told directly from the soldiers themselves. It's one thing for me, I say all the time, to criticize police, but if you can find police officers that criticize police officers, if you can find soldiers that have been in war and speak out against it, those messages are so much more powerful. And to have one Crozier on that ship is a huge affront. One person on one ship can actually start poking major holes in the whole thing. I mean, it's a house of cards in many ways, Jamal. And one or two of these stories that get amplified, you can see the backlash to it. The guy basically calling this person an idiot and incompetent to a boat full of soldiers who just chanted him off, and trying to basically slap all of them in the wrist too for saying, how dare you support this man? This is not what you signed up for. It's quite disgusting to me. Jamal, another story here we just wanted to get in. There's a coughing tiger in New York. Just when we thought we'd passed peak tiger and everyone had recovered from Tiger King, a Bronx Zoo beast has tested positive for COVID-19. New York really is the new epicenter for this thing. Zookeepers are saying that the tiger and her coughing tiger pals all seem fine, and the zoo vets are keeping an eye on them. This is the first animal in the U.S. known to have contracted the virus. The zoo reckons the tiger was infected by a zookeeper, but it's not the first animal in the world to have gotten it. Officials in Hong Kong have discovered COVID-19 in at least one cat and 2 dogs quarantined with their infected owners, while a cat in Belgium showed some signs consistent with the virus after its owner returned from Italy and later tested positive, according to the San Francisco Gate. Jamal, I am being told after several short naps, the cat in Belgium is feeling better. But I do want to know, where is this tiger able to find a COVID-19 test when there's millions of Americans still awaiting theirs?
That's utterly hilarious. I love that they tested the tiger. And yet we can't get tests for most of the people who need one. That's astonishing. We do have a caller on the line. Evelyn, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
How's it going? Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Love to listen to you guys.
Oh, thank you. So what's on the topic for today?
I guess this is going to be like a little public service announcement, I think, regarding the Affordable Care Act and what's going on now, the COVID-19.
Go for it.
My understanding is that Hillary Clinton has injected herself in the COVID-19 conversation by offering a non-solution, saying that Trump should open the marketplace. That is a clear, deliberate diversion, in my opinion, to the conversation on Medicare for All, because it's always been the case with health insurance companies, including the Affordable Care Act, that when a person experiences what they call a life-changing event, which includes becoming unemployed, the person qualifies to enroll for health insurance after the open enrollment period. Now I'm going to read off of the Marketplace website. Losing a job-based coverage qualifies you for a special enrollment period. This means you have 60 days to enroll in a health plan, even if it's outside the annual open enrollment period. So I think this whole thing about, the marketplace and people applying for open enrollment, we need to, it's clear that you can apply when you become unemployed and Trump doesn't have to do anything. And the conversation needs to go back to Medicare for All.
That's interesting. I mean, Hillary Clinton, and you're right, it's not just Hillary Clinton, though. The Democratic Party as a whole was arguing or hollering about marketplace. When the issue is that millions of people have just lost their health insurance. And all of the, 10 million people have lost their jobs. And these people need to pay their rents, they need to pay their car notes, they need to pay for their kids. And now they have no income to do so. So it's like the marketplace is nice, but how are they going to pay for the marketplace for something that they don't necessarily have the money to pay for the other expenses? And then you have half of the country don't have $500 or $400 in the bank for an emergency? That's somewhat of a crisis. And Evelyn, I think you're right. The Democratic solution is somewhat of a non-solution to, issues that are much larger than what these kind of health exchanges are going to cover. They're so wed to the Obamacare stuff.
Yes. And the other thing is that through the marketplace, depending on your income, you can qualify for a zero premium, monthly premium, but you still have a $7,000 deductible, which is what I have right now. So when Trump is saying that they will cover, if you get sick with the COVID-19, they'll cover you if you're not insured, is that for the underinsured, I would qualify myself as an underinsured. So we start stepping into more muddy waters with this whole thing, because some people are underinsured, which means you have a high deductible, but you are insured technically.
Yeah. Thank you, Evelyn, for your call. And Jamal, it just again goes to the fallacy of so many of these different solutions being offered. I just think of Andrew Yang's universal basic income, and somehow people thought his $1,000 a month would be able to cover people's groceries, people's rent, people's health care, people's basically ability to enjoy life within a very expensive capitalistic system in so many different places. And so no matter what we do at this point, especially when it comes to healthcare options being offered by Democrats or Republicans, it's always going to be dramatically short. There's not a Medicaid for all answer. If Evelyn has to pay $7,000 a year in deductible, that's not financially sustainable. And that's just puts more stress on the individuals within this country who are supposed to live here. Quick update here. Breaking news. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evans on Monday issued an executive order to delay the state's presidential primary for 2 months because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you.
Almost certainly prompt a court challenge and inject new uncertainty moving forward. Jamal, we'll have to talk about that tomorrow. We're out of time today. A big thank you to Anya Prampil and Mohammed El-Mazi for joining us. Big shout out to Jamal, Thomas, Michelle Whitty, all of our engineers working hard for us. You've been listening to Political Misfits live in Washington, D.C. Now get back to organizing.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today on By Any Means Necessary, we'll be talking about the racial, the class, the gender dynamics of the struggle of paramedics dealing with the coronavirus. Also going to be talking about the reality of racism against Chinese people and Asian Americans in the United States as a result of the U.S. government's reaction to the coronavirus. Also going to be talking about how the pandemic is playing out in the UK. And as always, at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be taking your calls. But before we can move on, Jackie, tell them what's on your mind.
Well, Sean, I cannot believe we are still talking about holding Democratic primaries as originally scheduled this week. But yeah, we are. In the midst of the defining moment of our times, even the spread of COVID-19 apparently will not push the primary election in Wisconsin tomorrow to be rescheduled, despite a last-minute maneuver from Wisconsin's Governor Tony Evers, a stay-at-home order, a massive shortage of poll workers, and pleas from mayors across the state to postpone the primary amid one of the worst public health crises in U.S. history. Now, trying to prepare for the inevitability of not being able to reschedule the primaries, Milwaukee cut the number of in-person voting sites from 180 across the city all the way down to 12, from 180 to 12. More than 100 counties in Milwaukee alone have no poll workers at all. The state has ordered 1.5 million pens so that no one needs to touch one that has already been used, but efforts to obtain 1.5 million sanitizing wipes have fallen short by 750,000. Now, Wyoming, as well as Alaska and Hawaii, on the other hand, were scheduled to hold their primaries this past Saturday, April 4th. But while those states and several others eventually did reschedule their primaries to later in the year, they had also already transitioned their voting apparatus to increase mail-in ballots, to include ranked choice voting, and they would have been able to shift the entire primary to vote by mail. Now, according to Politico, Wisconsin's Republican-led legislature just shrugged its shoulders at an 11th-hour call from Governor Tony Evers to halt in-person voting. They gavelled in and out of a special session in seconds without taking any action. Republicans basically said to the citizens of Wisconsin, we don't care if y'all die. And in this particular issue, at this particular time, this matters in the context of electoral politics and voting. Because, see, people are always bashing Black folks about voting, telling us we need to vote because our ancestors died for the right to vote, shaming Black folks who don't vote. But now that coronavirus is the threat that is going to both keep many Black people in Milwaukee in particular from voting, and it will put Black people's lives at risk if they try